I'd like to welcome all of you to our, actually, I put the wrong date in here. My apologies, to our December webinar. I guess I was thinking forward to January. It's our December webinar. It is actually December 14th, not January 25th, thank goodness. But thank you for joining us. And as we learn from our experts today about creating a crisis management capability. I'm really excited to welcome Tom Serio here. Tom Serio has been, he currently is a senior consultant at MTS and Associates, and he's been a long-time member of I-Corps, as well as one of our instructors, specifically for today, at least sharing his information on crisis management communications experience. He has 30 plus years of experience in all of those areas, and he's been a director of corporate compliance. He's done a lot. I've listened to him talk a lot about crises he's managed for Verizon Wireless as well as Office Depot. We're really happy to have Tom join us today. Our second guest speaker is Susan Bernier, and I should say Tom comes from Florida, where he's been managing lots of disasters in the last few months, and Suzanne comes from Canada, and we're excited to have her with us as well. She is also one of our instructors for our crisis management communication professional, and she is the president of SB Crisis Consulting, and she also has a book that she's written on disaster heroes, which is really interesting. She is a former journalist. She is a consultant. She does many speaking engagements, and she works with both governments and communities as well as companies. She was also named Continuity and Resilience Consultant of the Year by Business Continuity Institute, and she had the honor of being a guest speaker at the White House during FEMA's 2016 Emergency Preparedness Award ceremony. So welcome, Suzanne.
Thank you. All right, so I guess this is me just taking it away.
Yeah, Suzanne.
Thanks,
why don't you tell me
Linda.
what that photo is?
Oh, yeah, so this photo is me with all of the rest of the boys that were part of the emergency management team for our province. And so this was taken several years ago. I started as an officer when I was 27 years old, and I ended up becoming the first female uniformed field officer. And you can kind of see from here, it's just me. I'm the only girl at that time, but there's been tons since. So just to prove that I've been around for a while, and everything from boots on the ground, response and recovery, to planning and BCP now, and all of that other stuff in between.
Thank you. Suzanne, you want to talk about the purpose of today?
Sure. So we're going to familiarize participants with the steps required to help them develop an effective crisis management capability. And it's to help people learn how to self-evaluate the contents and the effectiveness of their own crisis management or management, business continuity, DR plans, procedures, and processes, and to identify ways we can maybe all work better together during a crisis, including with survivors.
Good. So we've got a new area. Good afternoon, everybody. Tom Serio here. It's a pleasure to be here with you, of course, having Linda having us on her webinar and working with Suzanne. She and I have worked together for many, many years, came up through the ranks in this field, and we've done many presentations and classes together. But let's talk about what the risks and the threats are. You know, we are bombarded every day with risk, and our business isn't getting any easier, especially when it comes to certain things like cyber and ransomware. You know, those things are happening every day. We see ransomware being a forefront in the news almost daily, with some terrible results. You know, it's a very, very serious thing, this ransomware, and if your company's not up on it, you've got to get up on it. But you know, when we look at threats, we have risks, and we have, of course, active shooter, intruder, and workplace violence situations happening all the time. Seems to be in the news all the time. Terrorism, domestic and international. You know, the climate changing. We've got severe weather. I mean, just today we've got some very severe weather rolling across the U.S. Snowstorms, blizzards, tornadoes, rain. A lot happening just on a regular basis. And of course, down here where I live in Florida, we deal with hurricanes a major risk all the time. but don't underestimate the impacts that protests and civil unrest can wreak on your business. They can put you out of business. We're going to talk more about that. Suzanne's going to give you some examples of that in a few minutes. Infectious disease, we just went through a pandemic. Whoever thought we would go through a multi-year disaster? But we just did. And there's a lot of lessons learned, of course. It really kind of changed the game for us planners. What do we do? Now we have people working from home. That really, now you're extending the office to people's dining room tables. What does that do to, in our disaster planning scenarios? And reputational crises. When we talk about disasters, there's a reputation involved here. There's a branding involved here. You work for major companies. I work for Verizon, Office Depot. These are companies that you see every day, basically. And we've got to minimize or eliminate impacts to our reputation and to our brand. We don't want to be tarnished by disasters and things like that. So that is part of your job. If you don't think it is, you've got to reassess and think about this. So let me jump in here for defining a crisis. So yeah, a crisis, an abnormal or extraordinary event or situation that can threaten an organization or community, even the area around you. Look at these widespread disasters, hurricanes. I've never seen a hurricane stop at a county line or a state line. The wildfires and things like that. You've got to have a strategic, adaptive, and timely response. In order to preserve its viability and integrity, you've got to keep your business up and running. One of my things that I always go by is I've got to make a disaster transparent to my customer. So what can we do there? We can look at many different things. We can anticipate what can happen. What's a high risk? What's a probability level of things happening and the level of impact? Right? How do we cope with that? What can we do to mitigate some of these threats and risks? And then how do we adapt to it? You look at COVID. We have had to adapt to live in a COVID world. Okay, if you don't think of that on a regular basis, you need to, because we've changed a lot of things over the past couple of years. So a lot is happening. Suzanne, you want to jump in here and share about some of crisis management capabilities?
Sure. So I guess with process management, I think it always helps when people develop kind of a schematic on crisis management and exactly what the requirements are, and usually for a crisis management capability. And besides, this simplified kind of chart here or this graph here, but let's go to the next slide.
There you go.
Yeah, so here are the basic 4 requirements to be able to develop a solid crisis management capability. So intellectual requirements, so that's all situational analysis, strategies, all of that stuff. Organizational requirements, I think we all kind of know that. A cultural requirement, internally as well as externally, and logistics. So those are the key requirements that need to be identified and filled out and have people performing roles and responsibilities to fulfill all of those requirements.
Suzanne, you talk about cultural requirement, and a lot of companies don't understand that your a recovery scheme and your business continuity should become part of your culture. Your employees need to know what the company is doing to protect them, to protect the company, protect their clients or patients. And that should become part of the culture. When we're seeing that, companies I work for, right, is you see that more and more. It's coming from the top down and being embedded as part of doing business, correct?
Yeah. Yeah, excellent point. So we'll go to the next slide. All right, so just a little bit more guidance on building that crisis management capability. It's creating a way of working that will help you through the toughest, crisis situations. Because we all have some kind of complexity, this way of working is simple and effective. Typically involves developing policies, procedures, handbooks, guidance, etc., at various levels. All of you all have, as we all have, various types of crisis management plans, including crisis communications plans and other support plans and BCPs, etc., that support the whole crisis management capability and resiliency. I'll toss in the word resiliency because that's the word of the decade, it appears like, now within within our area. So
it is.
Tom, I don't know if you want to go and deal with the next slide.
Yeah, but I do want to talk real quick about policies. I'm seeing more and more
Yeah,
companies
yeah.
needing to develop policies to understand what those swim lanes are when it comes to business continuity crisis management. How far out do we go? What are we including? So your corporation, if you don't have a policy yet or a framework, you really need it'll behoove you to put one together. uh, Many
Yeah.
times I see where auditors want to see this kind of stuff. What is the policy for BCP? What's the policy for cyber? What's the policy for ransom? Do we pay ransom? Do we not pay ransom? These things have to be identified because it really should be decided by the business where you go. As the planners and crisis managers and things like that, it may not be our decision, but management should be making that decision and letting us know where we should go. So now
Yeah.
let me take this here. So we've got various structures. You can set up very varied incident command structures, as you will. Many times you have an incident commander or your crisis manager, and they're being fed and shared information with liaisons and safety folks and your PIOs. And then you run down to your different functional areas, operations and planning and logistics and finance, and then you can break those down. Basically, set up a structure that works for you. And there are many structures out there, and it's not one size fits all. So depending upon your organization, the structure of your organization, are you flat, are you hierarchical, and culturally, if it's accepted, let's set up your own incident command. But there needs to be a structure. This can actually be defined in your framework for your program. So I've done a lot of work with crisis management teams. I've set them up, I manage them, I retest with them. So if you don't have a crisis management team, let me think about this. Who is going to run the disaster? Who's going to run the crisis when it occurs? Who's in charge? I've been in situations where the executives thought they were in charge, and they run around a little bit too much for me. Um, where I think a crisis management team is essential to help control the flow of information, the flow of resources, the flow of reporting, and it really gives a good structure. So what you need to have here are several components. So in crisis management, you need to have a leader of the team. Okay, and by the way, that's not always the CEO. A lot of people think, oh, the top guy's got to be the leader. No, most likely it's going to be you. The continuity planner, the crisis manager. You become the crisis management team leader, and now it's your responsibility to lead the team. Of course, on the left side of the slide there, you're going to have various teams. This will change depending upon business, but you need some administrative support. You need a scribe. You need somebody to keep track of things here. You want somebody from finance in there to keep track of expenses because, by the way, if you've never been through a disaster, go to one. You're going to see the fact that disasters can be expensive. You can be expensive to prepare for, but they can also be very expensive to respond to. When a company is spending money, they want to keep track of those finances. So you want to make sure you have a finance person there who's working with the risk person because you may have an opportunity to put in an insurance claim. So you need to make sure that these are the people that are sitting at the table. Your operations people, your project management office folks, HR, employee relations, ER, your risk manager, your legal and compliance people. And you say, well, Tom, legal and compliance don't have anything to do during a disaster. They may not functionally or operationally, but you want them to be the watchdog. You want them to oversee what you're doing to make sure you're staying within the limits. If you're a financial institution, you've got a lot of regulations you have to live by. I worked at ChenMed. We're a healthcare organization. You got HIPAA rules and all kinds of things. I tell my legal and compliance person, I said, look, watch us. Make sure that we're not breaking the law while we're trying to respond to a disaster. Because if we do, then it's on you because you should have caught it. And if you're a supply chain, a retailer, folks like that, you want to make sure you got plans for how to, your warehouses, just, interruption to transportation and other components. So put together a crisis team. I'm going to tell you right now, every crisis team I put together were people that wanted to have and wanted to be part of the team because they saw the need to have a crisis team because they also know that a disaster has the potential to put you out of business. So you want to make sure that you got people there who are fully engaged, who are charged with various tasks to do during a crisis. Okay, they need to be educated, and then you do, of course, do your exercises before that. But you need to have that plan for new and emerging risks. Okay, we talk about ransom, and we're seeing it all the time, and it's devastating, and it can cost you a lot of money, and it can cost you a lot of data. And their organizations, I've been tracking one situation of a ransomware attack that started in September in a government agency, and it's still not done yet. So this, it can really knock you out. And let me tell you something. The guys, many times, the folks that are doing these ransomware attacks, they're already in your system. They may have been in your system for days or weeks. So when you say, well, if I have a ransomware attack, I'll just go to my backup tapes and pull them down and restore. Well, they may have corrupted your backups also, all right? And you may not know it because you haven't exercised with those tapes. You haven't done a restore. So, don't think that, hey, when it happens, I can just go back and restore. Chances are you may not be able to, because that data can be corrupt also. Basically, a ransomware attack encrypts your data, right? And then what they're trying to do is they're selling you the key to decrypt your data. They don't necessarily delete it. They might through the process, but typically what they want is they're holding you hostage for the key to encrypt your data. Okay. Bottom line, your files can be lost. Bottom line, it can be a huge hit to your reputation, your brand, your operation. Then there can be companies that may not want to do business with you because you were exposed. So you've got to look at the risk. If you're not addressing ransomware, you've got to look at it now, not tomorrow, today. All right. If you're not looking at addressing cyber, how to keep the bad guys out of your system, you need to start looking at that now. This is near and dear to me. Hurricane Ian flooding October. I went through Hurricane Ian down here in South Florida. I went through Hurricane Ida last year in the New Orleans market, and we just had her tropical storm or Hurricane Nicole came by the east coast of Florida. But these are real situations, and as crisis managers, we have to understand what is happening here. Understand what is going on. First of all, communications. Communication is key. Suzanne and I teach the I-Core Communications course, and it really is an eye opener to our students because you have to really understand what they're up against. You can't assume everything. You're going to have extended power outages. And that's going to be in your area. And that can be in a wide area. Like I said, these storms and these disasters don't stop at county and state lines, so they can be extensive. And I've had people tell me now, in the post-COVID world, oh, I'll just tell the people to go home and work from there. Well, that doesn't work because they're impacted by the same disaster you're being impacted at headquarters. So you really got to have to look at this game of telling people to go home and work from there because they have the same situations. You may be forced to go back to old schools and methods of communication, okay, door to door, moving out of the area, couriers and things like that. Because we know at times after a disaster, your landlines can be out, your POTS line may not be working, your wireless may be down. And people are like, well, I have a mass notification tool. Well, yeah, but the mass notification tool uses your landlines and your wireless lines and things like that. So even though you may have a tool, the infrastructure may not be there. But let me add something else in here. I did work at Verizon for 9 years, and I'll tell you this today. If you don't know what your carrier is doing for you for a disaster, you need to find out from them. Go to them and say, how are you protecting the network during a disaster? What backups do you have in place? Just the wireless side, what cell sites and switch buildings have battery backup? Which ones have generators? Okay, how are you keeping that signal up and running at the worst possible time? You're the customer, you have the right to know. Suzanne and I have spoken about this several times. That communication is critical, and also the fact that you need to know what's going on. How are they going to take care of you? Because the worst thing you want to do is be in front of your CEO trying to answer a question you have no answer to. Assume that loss of primary comms. What's the outage going to be? We drive by cell sites here, and you see a generator at the base of the cell site. You say, "Oh, great, that cell site's going to be up and running after a disaster." Well, no, because that generator may be purchased by one carrier and not the other 4 carriers on that cell tower. So you have to know who's got the backups, who's got the batteries, who's got the generators in place. You need to have multiple communication backups in place in advance. You cannot do this at a time of disaster. What this also may mean, you may need to move out of the disaster area. You may need to move out of ground zero and go to an exterior place where there is communications. And also, we need to be in touch with our staff. We need to understand what they're going through, if they're impacted. We do a lot of preparation, and when we talk about crisis management, we need to have a component there for the employees. Are we helping them to be prepared also and to survive a disaster? Do they have solar-powered radios? They have these crank radios. You can wind them up, and they'll run for a while. Flashlights and cell phone chargers. They make neat little solar panels for cell phones. And of course, you can plug them into your car and your landlines. I'm probably one of the few people here in the U.S. that still has a landline and a regular old telephone that's not a wireless thing because I want to be able to have every
Um,
opportunity. Yes,
I was just going to say, I think I'm
yeah.
the only person in Canada that has a landline as well.
You know what? Suzanne and I are old school, but it still works. So, um, but if you have a need, being in high risk areas, you want to have all the odds in your favor. Suzanne, why don't you jump in here and carry on the conversation?
All right. So let's go to the next slide. Actually, just a little bit more on the last point on crisis communications challenges.
Okay.
So ideally, we want to have all of our staff prepared in advance so that they can be better able to help their family and then come to work or perform whatever duties they need to perform. Um, so I always kind of encourage companies as part of their communications campaign annually or whatever, that they remind employees to have crank or solar powered flashlight, a phone charger, all that stuff built into one these days. And you can get them for very cheap, but I would encourage everybody to have one. And then also, if anybody does have an old school landline, just to remember that you need to have a corded telephone for it to work during a power outage. Not a cordless phone's not going to work. So some people don't really think about that or realize that because we don't really look at our landlines anymore.
No, good point. The quarter
And
phone is critical. Yep.
yeah, exactly. And now you can get corded phones probably at the dollar store, I'd imagine.
Tuck it away and save it for an emergency.
Okay, well, let's go to the next slide.
Okay. There you go.
Yeah, so we're seeing a lot more of these lately, and I don't think there's anybody who hasn't heard of or maybe experienced or known someone who's experienced a demonstration that turned into something more. And potential violence. We've seen deaths as well. But we're seeing these mass gatherings in different places now where injuries and deaths are occurring. So it's not just at the usual protests that you would think of. But there are other gatherings lately that we've seen numerous injuries and deaths as well. So communities really do have to start recognizing and planning for the potential for mass gatherings, not only for protests such as this one, which of course we are seeing around the world now, but also if we go to the next slide, I think I have a picture there.
To U.S. concerts.
Yeah, so here we go. Now this was the Travis Scott concert that happened earlier this year. And I don't know if anybody remembers or heard about it, but there were multiple deaths at the concert for people who got they were squished in and then they lost consciousness and some of them lost their lives. So it was a horrible situation, horrible event that you wouldn't imagine happening at a concert event that everybody's there just to have a good time. But it turned into a death trap.
So then also the
Next,
fact,
yeah,
well, just on a point here though, and our audience today may be saying, well, that's not near me. That's not part of my business. Those could be your employees in there. You can have a
exactly.
function, where you lose employees. What is your crisis management plan for your staff?
Yeah,
If you don't have people showing up to respond to a disaster or people that were impacted by the disaster, what's your plan for that?
exactly.
So that's why, Suzanne point is critical here. You don't, sometimes you just don't expect it. You go into a concert, a lot of people, and something happens and it can be a stampede. I remember going to the jazz festival in New Orleans one year and it was packed. I mean, basically you just shoulder to shoulder with people and I'm uncomfortable with that. I'm a little claustrophobic. I couldn't deal with it. I actually left. But, you know, when you have an event like that and then something happens on top of it and people are rushing, you think it's not a big deal. But here on the next slide, Suzanne, you go ahead and talk about the South Korea situation.
Yeah. So I think a lot of us might have seen in the news a few weeks ago what happened on Halloween night in South Korea. Everybody was assembling just in a really narrow kind of street, as you can see from this image. And there were several deaths and horrific injuries as well from that stampede that happened. And you just never know if and when something like that is going to happen. I was in the middle of a similar situation that turned into a stampede when there was an active shooter event at a big Toronto Raptors party here in the city of Toronto. It turned into a stampede because someone shot a gun in the middle of the event. And then it turned into a tsunami of people that were charging away. And that's what caused all the injuries, were those who were running away and then running over people who had brought their strollers and different things. So it's also not just a cautionary tale for businesses, but for communities and for people to take a look at your circumstances and the circumstances of the event you're going to or you're at, and plot out and map out where you safely can be. And also don't bring vulnerable people with you that may get injured if they can't take care of themselves, if they have to run quickly. So there are all kinds of those kinds of considerations that I think now more than ever people have to take on before going to any event.
Yeah, no, because it can turn very bad very quickly, as Suzanne mentioned in this situation here in South Korea.
Yeah.
Tell us more about active
And then,
shooter.
yeah. So workplace violence, active shooter prevention. One thing I can say, and it's already happening, I think, is that as a result of the pandemic, and we're not talking about the pandemic at all throughout this presentation, but just here for a second, I do believe that, with the mental health challenges that we've been experiencing throughout the pandemic and we will continue to experience, we are going to see a lot more of these types of events because of affected people who may not have the help they need before it's too late. And so I just want to talk a little bit about how we can try to prevent or communicate ahead of time or during this kind of an event based on something that happened and lessons learned that happened at one of the first crisis communications organization workplace violence attacks that happened in December 2015. But there was a lot of lessons to be learned with that. So in San Bernardino, you may or may not remember, probably don't, because there have been so many other active shooter situations since then. But at the time, it was known as the largest terrorism act on U.S. soil since 9/11. So 14 were killed in a conference room and multiple injured, some critically, after that mass shooting that broke out in San Bernardino. But let's talk about a couple of the issues to think about that you probably never would think that you'd have to plan for. And they didn't plan for it, of course, but now they know that they have to. So if we go to the next slide, I think it shows, so there's a bunch of things that happened because apparently the employer did not communicate effectively through leadership all the way down. So what did you get? Well, you got a loss of valued employees. First of all, they lost 14 of their critical key staff. Boom, gone, never to come back with the death. But on top of that, they had an extra about 60 staff that were either not going to come back anytime soon or will never come back or have no idea if they're going to come back or not. So how do you deal with that? How do you plan in advance for something like that? I don't know that you can. There was a lack of trust in the organization afterwards, which damaged the reputation of that organization. And then, of course, there's a community ripple effect because of all of those survivors or the victims' families now are going back home to their families, and whatever trauma they're experiencing is going back onto their families and their friends and the community at large. And then we're now seeing secondary trauma and deaths from active shooter situations. And I mean, people who have survived the initial attack end up dying by suicide, sometimes months or years afterwards. And that is continuing on. There's been 2 that I know of in San Bernardino specifically. And then the reputational damage, of course, is going to be huge, especially if you don't respond or communicate effectively. And there's going to be litigation. There's all litigation in the works, and you'll probably be hearing about it all soon enough when it hits the news. But there's going to be a lot of litigation ongoing. And here's another thing that people might need to consider as well is planning for who should be the person that people are referred to, or the team or whatever, if they have concerns of an employee. Because this was an employee that ended up, and his wife that ended up shooting up all of his colleagues. But apparently, one of the widows had said that her husband had placed several complaints about the person responsible, and nothing was done. I don't know if that's the case or not, but that's what they said, but nothing was done. And then he ended up being one of the first victims of the attack. And so that's going to be one of the first pieces of litigation that you're going to hear about.
So yeah, let me throw in here. You talk about reputational damage here. You know, if
Yeah.
you have an active shooter situation at a location, people may very well feel that that location or that company may not be safe anymore because they're not safeguarding against active shooters. They don't have security guards. You know, you walk into what we call soft targets, grocery stores, churches, things like that. You don't typically find security guards in those locations, and there have been shootings in churches that we know, and grocery stores and
Yeah.
places like that. So that can really, impact your reputation and say, okay, we know there's a risk, and it has occurred, but we still don't want to put security guards in a building, in a grocery store, because it gives a negative sense to people, perhaps. But you still got it reputational damage because now people may not want to shop in your stores or go to your buildings because there's a level of risk that is real.
Right. Yeah. And the employees feel the same way.
Yeah. So there we go. I mean, reputation, a reputation that took decades to build can be threatened by a single event. So, you've really got to think about this and the fact that, look, many people on this webinar today, we're crisis managers, and your company looks at you as being the expert. So when it comes to anything negative like this, they're going to likely look back to you saying, what are we doing about this? How have you prepared for this? And, if you're in these high risk scenarios, and down here in Florida, of course, hurricanes are the highest risk down here for interruption. My management would always say, what are you doing about this and how are we prepared and what can we do better next time, after the fact? So, you've got to be on the ball here, and it's our job to be aware of not just the risk and the probability and the impact, but what it can do to our reputation. We are an ambassador for our companies. So I don't want my business to have a bad rap from a situation. I know you guys don't want that either. Suzanne, what you want to talk about this scenario here? These two gentlemen on the screen.
Yeah. So this is my little example of reputation management and a failure of it, I guess. Some of you might remember or recognize this image of the gentleman with the glasses falling from his face. This is the United Airlines passenger, a doctor who was dragged off the plane after he refused to give up his seat for a staff person. And so, of course, nowadays everybody has access to a camera and the means to be able to disseminate it quickly everywhere. So, of course, this person starts being dragged, and people have their phones out and they're videotaping it, as anybody probably would in that kind of a situation. But the other thing is, 1 minute later, someone posts it or someone tweets it, and it's halfway around the world before the company even knows what's going on. But in the end, what happened was, so he was dragged off, he was injured. They finally gave him an apology, but it wasn't until after they reviewed the comments that they were being perceived negatively. And then they kind of changed their communications narrative, but it was too late. But I'm just using as an example of the image of this doctor ended up being the face of United Airlines for like 7 days straight when this happened. And you don't want that to happen. You want to be the CEO of United Airlines, who's on the inset there, and you want him to be the face of the incident and speaking about it. But because he wasn't speaking appropriately and didn't communicate effectively from the beginning, he was not listened to, and everybody just went for that image of that video.
Yeah, and so
So
you got
there's more
all
of
over the
it.
news there. Hmm.
Yeah, so I'm sure he realized. And then here he is now trying to apologize, but I'm not sure how well it worked. He's not the CEO anymore anyway.
But there is conversely, there's a video that we show when we teach the classes of JetBlue. They had a big situation where they had a snowstorm, people were trapped on planes, the pilots were timing out, a major fiasco. But when you watch this video, and you might be able to find it on YouTube, the CEO actually comes out and talks about the situation. Okay, basically what happened, but how they failed, and then he gave you several steps on how they were going to correct the situation, how they were going to make it a better experience for the flyer to be with JetBlue, and then he asked for your trust, but he did it in a very casual way. He wasn't a suit and tie, he was just very talked directly to the camera. So when we talk about corporate communications, there are so many different things that you need to be thinking of. And corporate communications, of course, is part of crisis management because it's a component of crisis management. How you communicate, internally and externally, is critical. Um, so when you start looking also about your crisis considerations, train everybody, train all the members who have the role. If you are going to be that front person to speak to the media, you need to be trained in media, talking to the media. Have a training schedule for all components. If you guys have plans in place but are not exercising your plans, you've got to do it. You have to do it because exercising is going to let you discover the shortfalls of your plan, and you want to find them during an exercise, not during a real disaster. But also, there are new things coming out. Look for these little there are several companies out there that do these micro simulations, these micro tests. So you don't have to have these big giant exercises with 60 people for a full 5 days or whatever it may be. You can do these micro simulations. So there are companies out there that are focusing on that and helping you do that. Because you've got to ensure that the plans are in place, procedures are in place, and the people who need to activate on them, everything is in place. So work with this external partner. Today talked about active shooter, and there are many police departments, local law enforcement that want to work with you to do active shooter training in your company. At ChenMed in Miami, Miami Gardens Police came in and gave 2 full days of active shooter training to employees. What to do, what to look for. You may not stop the shooter, but what can you do to mitigate the impact? What can you do to protect yourself, to protect your people? Look to your local law enforcement. Look to your local fire company. What? Because they want to come in and educate you on how to prepare for a disaster, how to run a fire drill. What is on your campus in your buildings that can be noxious or toxic or when it burns. Furniture nowadays, the material is toxic when it burns. So work with them. The Red Cross loves to do lunch and learns. We've got to educate our employees, understand what the critical infrastructure holds. Talk to your wireless carriers. Talk to your landline guys. Talk to your power companies. Down here, FPL does a good job educating folks, and they're always willing to share information. So reach out to these folks. Say, hey, I've got a building. Where's my power coming from? Is it coming from 2 feeds or 1 feed? And if I lose that feed, am I out of business? And how many substations do those feeds go back to? And really dig in because as a crisis manager, you have to either know the answer or know where to find the answer. Okay, and your partners. We talk a lot about partnerships, public-private partnerships, and private-private partnerships. Well, if you're not engaged with one in your local area, you need to be engaged. If you don't have one, start one. Okay, because the other thing is, your other businesses on the same street where you are having all the same concerns you're having. Why not work together with them? Why not leverage some strength in numbers? Why not talk to the state EOCs and the federal guys and FEMA and become part of the NBEOC, or become part of the new Private Sector Emergency Management Association, which is an organization by businesses for businesses to help businesses. So there are a lot of organizations out there that you can utilize to get information. You don't have to always reinvent the wheel. But we talk about crisis communications. Suzanne and I teach these classes for ICOR. We've got a lot of experience. That's what we bring to the table here. But you've got to look at your crisis communication plans. One of the things I've learned is don't assume that your corporate communications folks know what to do at time of disaster, because they may not. Okay, you've got to understand what it is they bring to the table. How are they communicating internally and externally? Who's the PR guy? Who's contacting the customers? Who's on social media? You got to have a whole social media strategy there. Who are your critical staff people? And if they're not available, who are their backups? So they talked about the spokesperson. You saw the gentleman from the airlines up there speaking. May or may not be a good decision. When I do work with companies, I tell them you may not want the CEO to be the first guy to speak. Why? Because if he gives out wrong information, who's going to correct him? But if you have the head legal guy or somebody from compliance sitting there and they say something wrong, then at least the CEO can come back later on and correct them. So be careful about who you put as your spokesperson. But whoever it may be, let's make sure it's the same person giving the right information on a regular schedule. Hold the exercise. You've got to do media training. Folks have to know. So as crisis managers, we have to know who's going to do that job. Because I can tell you right now, if the media shows up and you've got nobody to speak on behalf of your company, that's not a good sign, right? Consider who your key stakeholders are and learn how to develop a crisis management and communications plan. We teach that in ICOR. We know that from practical experience being in this industry for many, many years. Suzanne and I, 20, 30 years, both of us, and we've seen a lot. We've been to real disasters. We've actually had to implement disaster plans at our own companies. And when the media is knocking on your door, you better know who to put in front of that microphone. You've got to make sure they're trained. There's a whole cadence about being a spokesperson, in a company. What information you give, and when you give information, what are the proofs? Okay, if my employees are safe, how do I know they're safe? Well, we accounted for everybody. We did a head count in the parking lot, or whatever it may be. Be able to talk about the situation and give proofs to the situation. Little cartoon here. The executive there is saying, and so it's agreed, in order to sharpen our crisis management skills, we're enrolling in an apology workshop. Yeah, not the best course of action. You do want to learn how to apologize if you need to, but don't make that your forefront part of the plan. So, Suzanne, you want to talk about this part here, about the opportunities?
Sure. Yeah. So I think that the best way to be able to plan better next time is to look at whatever crisis that we've been involved with as an opportunity to get whatever messaging out that we want to get, an opportunity to develop our brand, an opportunity to get closer to customers. There are so many opportunities that can be taken after a crisis. And so a couple of considerations is, how do you want your organization to be seen during and after the crisis, regardless of whether your organization maybe was involved or not? Perhaps you were involved by donating things as part of the crisis. Or after the crisis is over, what do you want people to think about your organization's response? And then the next slide will kind of break it down a little bit simpler, which is basically, we say recovery a lot, where we respond and then we recover from an event, try to get back to normal as much as possible. But I've added the word in redemption, because I think that is something that we really need to think about more as well. So as the last slide stated, that we need to try to improve our brand, improve our customer relations. And wait, let's just go back to the last slide again, so I don't lose my, thanks. So redemption is all about that piece on turning the crisis into an opportunity. Now is your time, after the event is managed and over. Now is your time to look at how to not only revise your plans, but also on how you're going to redeem yourself to your customers, your clients, your employees, if needed, during an emergency. How are you going to show that you're doing better to make sure that something doesn't happen again? And so try thinking about what kinds of options could come up and what kinds of redemption opportunities you could make from different things.
And so let me just throw in here that shouldn't be done in a silo. When you're looking at reputation and branding and how to come up with redemption, since your brand was tarnished from a disaster, that takes multiple areas of a company to figure that out. It can be with the executives, with the PR team, with the marketing team, with the crisis team. But the point here is that as crisis managers, we are part of that solution. We're part of the problem perhaps up front, but we have to be part of that solution because anytime the company changes things like that, you've got to be aware of it. So it's interesting that it's been told to me in the past that if you want to learn about a business, go and find the crisis manager or the business continuity guy because they typically have a pretty good understanding of how the business works. If they've done their planning correctly, if they've done the BIAs and things like that. And as managers, that's our job. We need to do a BIA, business impact analysis. We need to understand the departments that are critical in your company. We need to make sure we have plans in place. Our role really gives us a very good overall view of the company that we're working for, the organization that we're working for. Um, so, don't lose sight of that because you've now become a much more valuable component of a business. And when we talk about building back, a lot of companies say, "Well, we're gonna recover and build the way we were." No, 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 don't build better, do better. How do we mitigate the threats on our recovery so we don't have the same issue again? We keep on rebuilding houses on the shoreline by the ocean, and they keep on being swept away. Well, we need to rethink this, guys. So how do we do this with your company? That's some of the stuff that you as crisis managers need to be reaching out, maybe to your crisis team or to some of the executives and say, what can we do if we have this type of disaster, like down here, hurricane, of course. If we have a hurricane, how can we build back better? Do we replace windows with hurricane-resistant windows or shutters, or do we do better planning, or do we do better preparedness, where we let our employees go home a half a day earlier so they can prepare their homes so they can survive and be back to work that much faster? So a lot of different things can come up. And that's one of the things Suzanne and I, when we teach these classes, we've got a lot of experience. This is the stuff that we share with our students. Suzanne, you want to run through the summaries here?
Sure. And you can feel free to chime in whenever you want.
Oh, I will.
So, well, we already know that a crisis can happen anytime, especially nowadays. And we want to remind everyone to establish connections in advance. This is also reminding everybody about, I hope you are involved with public-private partnerships activities where you are. If you aren't already, I would encourage everybody to be able to do that so that you can have that many more people as part of your team to respond to an event that involves a lot of players. And plan for today's top hazards and risks. And Tom went through them earlier at the presentation. So that's what we need to be doing, is planning for what our top hazards and risks are and monitoring what they are, because they're going to change over time. Ensure you have the proper plans and procedures in place to effectively communicate, because during an exercise or during an event, we always hear that communications gets criticized the most. So it's really important to figure out ahead of time how you're going to effectively communicate both internally and externally to support everybody's safety, health, and well-being throughout the crisis situation and afterwards. And then making sure that you continue to exercise and practice your plan, train participants at least once a year so everyone knows what to do and how to do it. Tom?
Yeah, and these are critical points here. You've got to make sure you have your plans in place, of course, but know what your top hazards are. You're not going to write disaster plans for every type of hazard. I had a buddy of mine years ago identified over 200 different types of disasters. It's like, okay, I tell new continuity planners and crisis managers, I said, look, start where you're out of business. Start with an all hazards approach. Okay, I'm out of business. How do I get back into business? And then what you can do is you work backwards and say, okay, what put me out of business? Now, down here in Florida, hurricanes are a big deal. Okay, I'm not worried about the earthquakes. I'm not worried about wildfires per se, even though we do have them. But I'm worried about hurricanes. So I'll write a pre-plan, a hurricane plan that gets enacted before the hurricane happens, and then we roll right into our all hazards plan. You may be in California. California, you don't care about hurricanes. It's wildfires, blackouts, and earthquakes, not in that order. Okay, so you've got events that are notice events where you notify that something's going to happen, like a hurricane or maybe a protest, and then non-notice events. You don't know when that earthquake's going to happen. You barely know when that tornado is going to happen. So plan accordingly. But I always say, for the newbies in this business, if you're going to start from an all hazards approach, at least let's get a plan started. I'd rather be 70% of the way there than rather have nothing at all. Get something going,
Yeah.
and it's not going to be right, and it's going to take time. And our plans, Suzanne and I both know we never write the perfect plan because things change, business changes, environment changes. Um, when you run an exercise, you're going to find things that are going to change your plan. So be open to that and be aware of that. That's part of the nature of the beast in our business.
All
So
right. Thank you both, Tom and Suzanne. This is an opportunity for the participants, if you want to put your questions in the questions pane. We did have one comment come in that was fun. It says that he has, let me see, a landline and DSL for internet.
mhm.
And then,
Oh.
yeah, I thought that was pretty creative. And then there was a question back when you were talking about policies. The question was, how do we separate the business continuity policy from the crisis management policy? And I think that question really is alluding to the overall fact that there are crises that happen in organizations that don't interrupt business operations. So the crisis might
Right.
be something that interrupts the business, but doesn't always, especially if it's more of a reputation piece. And so the question is, should you have separate policies or can they be all of one policy?
I think it depends.
I think so too. I think they should be. I think they should be separate policies if I'm understanding the question correctly.
Yeah, I think depending upon the environment and the culture of the company, they could be separate. And depending if you're a regulatory operation, bank or healthcare thing like that, you might want to have them separate because they may be addressed separately. Smaller companies may address them together, and where you can they'll put them into one policy, of course, identifiable by each one, but have them in one policy. But I wouldn't say have one policy for everything. I think we should have a business continuity framework policy, but we also need a DR policy. And a DR, when I talk about disaster recovery, I'm talking about technology, the IT side. So what are we doing for the IT recovery? What are we doing for cyber? There should be a cyber policy that's separate from everything else in cyber and ransomware because that is always changing. That's got a whole different set of eyes on it. That has a whole different set of impacts associated with it versus other types of disasters.
Well,
So,
and I
yeah,
think, Tom, what you've addressed here is the fact that it, it depends on the complexity of the organization and how they manage risk.
yeah,
So,
that's correct.
sometimes what we say is that you have different triggers or escalations for what the incident is.
Hmm.
And, can that incident be managed locally? Is it costing us whatever amount of money? And as these things, what's the damage to our reputation? How long do we think it's going to be? Whatever those criteria are. And then at some point, the organization has to make the decision that it meets the criteria for being a crisis and that you're activating more resources, you're activating potentially different people um, as well. So I think that's really the heart of that question is I would recommend, just like Tom and Suzanne said, to have multiple policies, but they're all part of perhaps an overall policy for managing risk. For example, you could put it under that so that all policies that have something to do with managing risk are part of that system. Um,
Yeah, I think the
yeah,
bottom line is at least having a policy that addresses it.
yeah, something in place. Other questions? I didn't see any other questions come in, but this is your last opportunity to ask a question before we end for today. Otherwise, if you could go to the kind of the closing slides, Tom,
Sure.
and if I see a question pop in, I will. We're
Okay.
excited to let you know that we have just finalized our 2023 webinar series, and we're going to be looking really at how we look through several lenses of operational risk management, as well as how you can strengthen your strategic resilience, and looking at the role of each one of these things as part of your overall strategic resilience. And I do see a hand up, but I can't answer hands on the webinar. I'm sorry. And also, just to let you know, like Tom and Suzanne shared, we do have education in this area. We also, in addition to our crisis management communication professional, we do have a crisis communication planner course that's specifically looking at crisis communications. Um, One of the comments was, we used to have a unified document that was an emergency action plan, but we split it up for BCDR, and evacuation and crisis handling. And that makes a lot of sense as well.
Yeah.
The other question that came in here, there's two more. Who is best suited to be crisis management head in an organizational framework? And that's a big question.
It is.
Yeah, Tom, I'm going to toss it to you.
Yeah. You're talking to me, okay? Well, let me put it this way: your crisis manager may be a well-versed person in the field and do great planning. They may not have the right personality to be a leader. Okay, so you've really got to look through, and if your crisis management team is going to say, look, we can, the crisis manager does a great job, but not good in a role, and not everybody's good in a leadership role. So let's go and find somebody. You may have your executive liaison be your crisis leader.
It should be someone senior in the organization, though, right?
Yes. Yes, it should be up the ladder, not down the ladder. So if it's not you as crisis manager, yes, it should be up. C-level is always great if you can get them to dedicate their time to the effort. But if not you, it should go upward and try to get a senior person.
And this is the second question. It might be a little tricky. It says, what is the minimum and maximum pages of a crisis management document? Should it detail all types of crises?
Wow. I'll answer first and see if Suzanne wants to give some input. I tell companies, look,
Okay.
it's not about the number of pages. It's about the content. Okay, you could be a small business of 20 people. Your plan may only be 10 pages long. If it's got the content that's going to allow you to recover your business, and that's what you need, that's fine. I'm not looking for big binders on shelves. What I do look for personally is that a plan has the administrative stuff up front, but somewhere in that plan there's a chapter, and that includes the executable part of your plan. That says, okay, we have a disaster. Step one, do this. Step two, do this. And somewhere in that plan, you have to be able to take that out and start executing from that checklist or process, whatever it may be. So how big the plan may be, not important. What's in the plan, critically important.
Yeah. Well, I agree with Tom. Sorry, Linda, you're going to say something?
I was just going to say, with so many plans being electronic and part of systems, we don't often think about them in pages anymore even.
That's true.
Yeah, that's true.
You know what I will tell you, Linda, is I worry about where you put the plan. I've heard a lot of companies say, well, everything's up in the cloud.
But then you can't access it. Yeah.
Right.
So you have a disaster, you don't have any internet access, you can't get at your plan. You better make sure you have a copy of your plan locally on a secure thumb drive, encrypted thumb drive, on your laptop, wherever, but even hard copy, that may be secured at your home office.
Yeah.
But,
with just about
Definitely.
one question left, I just wanted to share one more question. How does gamification, I don't know if I'm even saying that right, but I'm assuming it's about games. So gamification, I'm saying that correctly, play in how a crisis is managed, or how in crisis management itself. I'm assuming that's a form of exercise and that you're using that more of a technology approach when people say gamification.
Yeah, I've never heard that term being used. I know that we've done some exercises that are kind of like a game, where it's easier for the participants to understand what's happening if you make it like a game format. I'm of the schooling where any way we can educate our people, our employees, our crisis team, or even our partners out there, any way we can do that, either through gamification, tabletop exercises, round table, on site or at off site location, I'm for it. I mean, there's no set rule, so whatever's going to work for your people, I say go for it.
And then one last question is, has there been any advances in technology for emergency communications beyond satellite phones? This might be something for the audience even before, in the evaluation that comes out. If you have any ideas about that, post it in there and we can share that out too, to get to the larger audience.
Yeah, there's some technologies out there. I know there's something called a plum case that can pick up a wireless tower from 50 miles away, they claim. So there are some things other than satellite. Satellite is getting better. I'm not sure. I haven't looked into Elon Musk's satellite network yet, what that's capable of better communications. But yeah, satellites are tough. But you got to remember, just remember this: if you're at ground zero and you can't communicate, you may not be recovering there either. So you might have to go to an area that has all the
Oh,
infrastructure still intact.
well, I'm addressing, and just as we close, where I live, sometimes we only have satellite, and if we have a storm, we don't have satellite. If we have any sort of bad weather, we don't have any satellite at all.
Right.
So we lose everything. But I wanted to thank everyone for coming today. I wanted to thank our speakers. We really appreciate it. And we look forward to seeing everybody in 2023. Happy holidays.
Yes,
Thank
Don't
you,
think
Linda.
about
happy
Appreciate it.
crises
holidays,
during your
everyone.
holiday. Have a good time.
Take care.
Bye, everyone.
See you soon. Bye.